Hello, my name is Melanie Bradley, and this is my presentation for the 2021 UAFS Spring Research Symposium. I am presenting my paper, The Adaptation and Creation of Genre in the Last of the Mohicans. While Owen Wister's 1902 novel, The Virginian, is widely regarded as the first fictional Western in the pantheon of American literature, this title should be given instead to The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Published in 1826, The Last of the Mohicans is the first novel to blend within its pages the character types, themes, and most importantly, the particular setting that make up what is now recognized as a Western. Cooper created this prototype for subsequent Westerns by taking the ever-popular romance genre, full of adventure, often in exotic settings, adding a dash of the Gothic and adapting them, Americanizing them into the uniquely recognizable literary genre of the Western. While it is probable that Cooper did not intend to spearhead a new genre, The Last of the Mohicans fulfills the expectations of the Western genre and expands it past its currently understood regional boundaries, and does so with inventive use of established genre techniques and formats. Many would know a Western, be it literature or film, but as readers try to definitively describe what makes a Western, there is always some variance on what details matter and which do not. Numerous lists and debates are accessible online, but there are a few items that appear most universal. The setting is usually in the vast, unsettled wilderness or frontier. Most commonly a type of adventure story, Westerns include a semi-nomadic hero who frequently encounters a range of characters, including American Indians or outlaws, soldiers or lawmen, and settlers. Common themes include the conquest of the wilderness, the conflict between the natural rights of the American Indian and the legal rights of the Euro-American settler, guidance by some type of individual moral code, frontier justice contrasted beside civilized justice, and revenge. Remove any of these elements or add in something else, and most likely readers would still recognize and label the story a Western. By and large, the two most non-negotiable defining characteristics of a Western are setting and time. Popularly, and despite claims to the contrary scholastically, Westerns are described as being set in the latter half of the 19th century and regionally west of the Mississippi. While The Last of the Mohicans easily satisfies all the previously described expectations of a Western, the restriction of setting and time unilaterally disbar it from falling within that genre. This is a narrow and limiting view that precludes the idea that Cooper developed the blueprint for the Western. In order to rectify this discrepancy in time and place, an examination of the requirements of the Western setting must occur. The West is not simply a location within the Western genre, but a representation of an historic American conflict, Euro-American settlers versus the other. Jim L. Fife, in his essay, Two Views of the American West, published in the first volume of Western American Literature, proposes a similar idea. The fact that what has been called the West has moved from the eastern forest land across the Mississippi, over the prairies, and into the mountains and deserts suggests that the word West does not describe a geographical entity so much as it names an idea. The idea has always resisted attempts to identify it precisely, but it is clear that it has something to do with the romantic ideal of America's destiny which was so widespread in the 19th century and which, in fact, is by no means dead in the 20th. Following this line of thinking, it is clear that the West is not and cannot be restricted to a specific geographic location, but moves across the landscape through time along the inroads of Euro-American expansion. With that being the case, fixing the problem of both the setting and time and classifying The Last of the Mohicans as the prototype Western is easy. At the time of the story, August 1757, those parts of New York where the story takes place, Lake George and the surrounding woods, were indeed other, vast, unknown, populated by American Indians and subject to all the conflict associated with the American frontier and the West. With the matter of setting rectified, the rest of the commonly expected aspects of a Western are quickly identified in The Last of the Mohicans. Natty Bumppo, known as Hawkeye in this text, suits as a frontiersman the call for a semi-nomadic hero. His allies include Chingachgook and Uncas, the eponymous Last of the Mohicans, and one instance of representatives of American Indians. Hawkeye encounters Major Duncan Hayward of the British military and later acts as messenger for Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, both representatives of the soldier requirement. Cora, Alice, and their unintended companion David Gamet, while not settlers per se, certainly showcase what settlers represent in the genre, the everyman and the innocent in the other, striving against external forces for success. All that remains is the fulfillment of narrative expectations. Adventure is inherent in a Western, and The Last of the Mohicans certainly satisfies that count, beginning almost immediately when Cora, Alice, and Gamet, led by Hayward and Magua, first leave the main track for the shortcut to Fort William Henry. It is the literal and symbolic entering of the wilderness, the dark and tangled pathway, that heralds all the subsequent adventures, trials, and tragedies. Encountering Hawkeye, Chingachgook, and Uncas in the forest, the revelation that Magua is not friendly, and the entirety of the episode in, at, and on the cave at Glens Falls are not only excellent examples of adventure within the story, but also foreshadow and in some ways mirror the adventures of the latter half of the narrative, beginning with the massacre of the retreating British and the removal of Cora and Alice from that main track back into the wilderness, their isolation in another cave, leading up to the final tragic conflict atop the mountain. Each adventure reflects what came before. There can be no doubt that The Last of the Mohicans is, cover to cover, a cleverly wrought adventure story. Woven through those multitudinous adventures are many of the themes commonly associated with the Western. Some are explicitly addressed, such as the example of Hawkeye and Chingachgook discussing their differing perspectives on the conquest of the land in Chapter 3, which is then shown in the conflict between the British, French, and American Indians. Another example of an explicit theme occurs when Hawkeye mentions the ways in which his actions reflect a different moral code from that of his Mohican friends and their Huron enemies. Other themes are more subtly wrought, such as the juxtaposition of a kind of frontier justice, exemplified in Chingachgook's scalping of the French sentry after the party had successfully passed him, and the form of civilized justice shown in the council with Tamenund. Magua is given his chance to speak, Uncas is given his chance to speak, and then judgment is given by Tamenund. This civilized form is further enhanced by its immediate contrast to Hayward's promise to follow Magua after he is awarded Cora and allowed passage out of the Delaware village. He says, "These Delaware have their laws, which forbid them to detain you, but I have no such obligation." Hayward is set to exact his own frontier justice and enact a bit of revenge while acknowledging the existence of the civilized justice of the Delawares. Fortunately for Hayward, Uncas, who is submissive to the stern customs of his people, vows to pursue while still upholding the example of civilized justice. Now that the Western has been defined and The Last of the Mohicans shown to satisfy the expected requirements, one must turn to how Cooper achieved the inadvertent creation of this genre. Cooper started with an existing popular genre, one that had been put to good use by Sir Walter Scott in Europe, romance. Then, as David Lant points out in his essay, A Knight of Ancient Chivalry, The Last of the Mohicans as Medieval Romance, Cooper does not slavishly follow romance pattern, but instead experiments and adapts them to his purpose and landscape. Cooper takes familiar aspects of the romance genre, the knight errant, the quest, important weaponry, and even the exotic setting, and Americanizes them. Hawkeye, the semi-nomadic frontiersman espousing his personal moral code, neatly fits the role of the knight errant. The quest, which is the source of most of the adventure and of which there are two in Last of the Mohicans, involves the not required but oft included damsels in distress. Hawkeye and his companions must deliver Alice and Cora, and Gamet, who Lamp interprets as a minstrel of sorts, to safety, and later must, in classic romance fashion, rescue said damsels from distress. Hawkeye's rifle fulfills the role of swords named by the knights who wield them, as Killdeer is lovingly referred to time and again. Cooper's adaptation of setting is the last step in the Americanization process. Romances are often set in distant, exotic lands, places where the rules of society disappear into the other, and the knight-errant must hold his moral code for guidance. The American frontier, especially as Euro-Americans saw it, fulfills the exact requirements of the exotic, the other. The landscape is wild and untamed, populated by people with foreign customs. The rules of civilized society fall away, and the frontiersman must navigate this space with only his knowledge, experience, and personal moral code to guide him. Further adding to Cooper's inventive adaptation of an existing genre to his needs is his use of Gothic fiction techniques, especially in portraying the otherness of the frontier. Cooper's very first paragraph introduces the wilderness as vast, dangerous, and largely impervious, where those that venture into it expend months in struggling against its natural features. In the absence of huge dark manors with high towers and damp basements, Cooper substitutes isolating caves and craggy cliffs and mountains. In his essay, From Mountain Gothic to Forest Gothic and Luminism, Changing Representations of Landscape in the Leatherstocking Tales and in American Painting, Alan M. Axelrad writes that the vertical features in the landscape were indispensable to the narrative itself, functioning as Gothic sets on which major episodes in the story were staged, and that in Cooper's early fiction, the most soaringly romantic American landscapes had mountain Gothic properties. Working in tandem with these ominous settings was Cooper's use of the sublime. A common tool for the Gothic writer, Cooper used the sublime liberally to instill unease in the reader. An example of the sublime in Cooper's description of setting occurs with the juxtaposition of his initial description of Lake George as limpid and unsullied, with Hawkeye's experience of pushing a canoe out into the broad and dark shadow that fell from the eastern mountain on the glassy surface of the lake, and Chingachgook's watchfulness, his keen vision bent along the bald rocks and impending forest that frowned upon the narrow strait. One spectacular use of the sublime occurs when the band of characters are hiding in the caves at Glen Falls. The mood is briefly lighter than it has been, when a cry that seemed neither human nor earthly rose, unsettling even those experienced at navigating the wilderness. The strange unease this causes is further exacerbated when the horrid cry is repeated and Hawkeye stood with a countenance whose firmness evidently began to give way before a mystery that seemed to threaten some danger, against which all his cunning and experience might prove of no avail. It is really the creation of a Gothic landscape coupled with the looming unease of the unknown caused by the sublime that cements this specific type of setting as quintessential for a Western. Whether the unknown of the frontier is in the forests of the eastern United States, west of the Mississippi, or in the vast reaches of space, it is the movement away from civilization into the other with the looming unknown that will always bring a Western flavor with it. Pair this with the character types and adventures of a romance adapted to the unique spectrum of people the Americas offered as inspiration, and the blueprint of the Western becomes clear. While the definition of what makes a Western is broad and frequently difficult to specify, there are bare-bones requirements that can be identified and examined. When the features are compared to the early works of American literature, The Last of the Mohicans stands out as matching them all. Cooper wrote the first Western by taking uniquely American inspiration and adapting popular literary forms, romance and Gothic fiction, to suit his inspiration. The result was the beginning of a long-lasting and recognizable genre that spans literature, radio, and film.